Your mother believed you could do anything. Anthony stood at the dining table, looking at his 8-year-old twin sons. Their shoulders pressed together like they could split the weight of failing between them. Was she wrong? The boys didn't answer. They'd learned that silence hurt less than trying to explain what they couldn't understand themselves. Michael's tears fell quietly. Victor's hand found his brother's under the table. Their father grabbed his jacket and left the room. And in that moment, in that crushing, suffocating quiet, someone else was listening. Someone who knew exactly what it felt like to believe you were born broken. Catherine wasn't supposed to hear any of it. She'd been carrying a basket of folded towels past the dining room when Anthony's voice stopped her cold. She stood there just outside the doorway, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. It wasn't the anger in his words that shook her. It was what came after. That silence, the kind that sounds like a child's soul collapsing in on itself. She knew that sound. She'd lived inside it for years back, when every teacher looked at her like she was wasting their time. When words on a page looked like they were drowning. When she sat alone in her car at 19, staring at a job application she couldn't fill out, wondering if maybe everyone had been right about her all along, wondering if God had made a mistake when he made her. But standing there now, listening to two little boys trying not to cry, something stirred deep inside her chest. Not pity, recognition. Through the open door, she could see them. Michael wiping his face with his sleeve, Victor squeezing his brother's hand, so tight his knuckles turned white. Two boys who looked identical in everything, especially their shame. And for the first time in a long time, Catherine felt it. That quiet whisper she'd almost forgotten how to hear. This is why you're here. Not to scrub counters or fold laundry, but to see what nobody else could. Because sometimes, when the world has written you off, and you've got nothing left but your own scars, God puts you exactly where you need to be. Right in front of someone who's breaking the exact same way you once did. But before we begin, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. And if you've ever felt like you were too broken to be loved, stay with me. Because this story is about to show you that sometimes the people who save us are the ones nobody sees coming. Catherine knelt beside Michael's chair, the green overlay still resting on the open page. For a moment, neither of them moved, just sat there in the quiet of the library, dust floating through the afternoon, light coming in from the window. Michael stared at the words beneath the green sheet. His finger traced the first line. The cat sat. His voice was so soft she almost didn't hear it. On the mat. He looked up at her, eyes wide with something she hadn't seen in them before. Wonder. I read it. I actually read it. Catherine's throat tightened. She nodded, couldn't speak for a second. Victor stepped closer, his arms crossed tight over his chest like he was protecting himself from disappointment. Does it work for everyone? 5. 2. I don't know, Catherine said honestly. But we can find out. She pulled another overlay from her pocket, this one blue, handed it to Victor. He took it like it might break, placed it carefully over his own book, started reading. His voice shook at first, then steadied. By the third sentence, he wasn't stumbling anymore. Michael grabbed his brother's arm. You're doing it. Victor's eyes filled with tears. He didn't stop reading, just kept going, his voice getting stronger with every word, like he was proving something to himself. When he finished the paragraph, he looked at Catherine. Why didn't anyone show us this before? Catherine didn't have a good answer for that. So she just said, I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to figure it out now. Together, that became their rhythm. Every afternoon while Anthony was away, while the house was quiet and no one was watching, Catherine met the boys in the sunroom. Not the library. Too formal, too much like school. The sunroom felt different, warm, safe, light pouring through the windows, plants growing wild in the corners, the old couch where their mother used to read to them before she died. Catherine brought supplies from the kitchen, shaving cream, food coloring, baking sheets. The twins looked at her like she'd lost her mind. We're going to write with shaving cream? Michael asked. We're going to feel the words, Catherine said. Your hands need to learn them as much as your eyes do. She spread the cream across the tray, smooth and thick, showed them how to trace letters with their fingers. Say it, feel it, write it. Michael spelled cat in the cream, then dog, then mom. His face lit up. It's like drawing. Exactly, Catherine said. Your brain loves this. Victor preferred movement. He couldn't sit still for more than 5 minutes, So Catherine let him walk, let him read while pacing circles around the coffee table. "You think better when you move," she told him. "So move." He did, and for the first time in his life, the words didn't swim away from him. By the third day, something shifted. Michael finished his homework in 20 minutes, work that usually took him 2 hours. Victor read 4 pages of a chapter book without stopping once. They started laughing again, real laughs, the kind that filled the room and made the house feel alive. Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, noticed. She'd pass by the sunroom and pause, listening to their voices. Never said a word, just watched Catherine with an expression that was hard to read. The gardener, Mr. Alvarez, smiled when he saw them through the window one afternoon, gave Catherine a small nod, like he understood something the others didn't. But there were whispers too. In the kitchen, in the laundry room. "She's overstepping. She's just the help. What happens when Mr. Smith finds out?" Catherine heard them, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down on her shoulders every time she walked through the house. But when she looked at Michael spelling words in shaving cream, his whole face glowing with pride, she couldn't stop. When she watched Victor read aloud while walking in circles, his voice steady and strong, she knew. This was bigger than her job, bigger than their opinions. This was what she was meant to do. Friday afternoon came too fast. Anthony would be home tomorrow. The conference in Singapore had ended early. Catherine wiped down the coffee table, packed away the colored overlays, the textured letters, the baking sheet still smelling like shaving cream. Michael grabbed her hand. "You're not going to stop, are you?" She looked down at him, at both of them standing there, fear creeping back into their eyes. "I don't know," she said quietly. "Your dad might not understand." "Then we'll make him understand," Victor said, his jaw set with determination that looked just like his father's. Catherine smiled, sad and hopeful at the same time. Maybe. That night, she couldn't sleep. Lay awake in her small room above the garage, staring at the ceiling, praying for the first time in years. "God, if this is real, if I'm supposed to be here, please let him see it. Please." She didn't know if he was listening, but she closed her eyes and hoped anyway. The next afternoon, everything changed. Anthony came home 3 days early. No warning, no phone call. Just walked through the front door at 2 o'clock, exhausted from the flight, wanting nothing more than silence and sleep. He heard laughter coming from the sunroom. His son's laughter. He hadn't heard that sound in over a year. He set down his briefcase, walked toward the noise, pushed open the French doors, and froze. Catherine sat between the twins at the coffee table. Michael had shaving cream spread across a baking tray in front of him, tracing the word "believe" with his finger. Victor was mid-stride, walking his usual circle around the couch, reading aloud from a book about dinosaurs. All 3 of them were smiling, and Anthony, standing in the doorway, travel bag still slung over his shoulder, couldn't move. The table was covered, colored plastic sheets, letter tiles with different textures, headphones connected to an audiobook, a mess of learning that looked nothing like the rigid tutoring sessions he'd paid thousands for. "What the hell is this?" The words came out sharper than he meant them to. Catherine's heart dropped into her stomach. She stood quickly, hands already reaching for a towel to wipe the cream away. "Mr. Smith, I can explain. You're the housekeeper." His voice was tight, confusion twisting into something harder. "I hired you to clean, not to." "Dad, wait." Victor's voice cut through the air like a crack of lightning. He stepped forward, the book still clutched in his hand, his whole body trembling. "I read 12 pages today." Tears filled his eyes. 12, without stopping once. Anthony stared at his son, at the boy who hadn't finished a single chapter book in 2 years. "Please don't make her stop," Victor whispered. Michael scrambled to his feet, holding up the baking tray, shaving cream dripping onto the floor. "Look, Dad. I spelled dinosaur right. I never get it right." He grabbed his homework from the edge of the table, pages of math problems, handwriting practice, reading comprehension. Completed, nearly perfect. Handed it to his father with shaking hands. Anthony took it, stared down at his son's neat, careful work. His jaw worked. No words came. Catherine stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't ask permission, Mr. Smith." Her voice was quiet, steady, but I recognized something in them, something I've lived with my whole life. Silence pressed down on the room like a weight. The twins stood side by side, hands clasped together, terrified. Anthony's eyes moved from the homework to their faces, his sons' faces, glowing with something he hadn't seen since Rebecca died. Pride. When he finally spoke, his voice barely made it past his throat. "My office, now." He turned and walked away, his footsteps heavy on the wood floor. Catherine's stomach twisted into knots. The boys looked up at her, their faces crumpling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, kneeling down between them. "I'm so sorry." Michael threw his arms around her neck. Victor buried his face in her shoulder, and for a moment, Catherine just held them, feeling their small bodies shake, wishing she could protect them from what was coming. The walk to Anthony's office felt like walking to her own execution. Every step down that long stretch toward his door, Catherine's mind raced. She'd be fired. Of course she'd be fired. She'd overstepped, broken trust, done exactly what she'd been warned not to do her whole life, tried to be more than she was allowed to be. She knocked. "Come in." Anthony sat behind his desk, laptop open in front of him. His jacket was off, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up, but his face, she couldn't read it. "Sit." She sat, folded her hands in her lap to keep them from shaking. Long, suffocating silence. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me exactly what you did with my sons." Not angry, not accusing, just tired, and something else she couldn't name. Catherine took a breath, then another. "I saw dyslexia," she said quietly. "Classic signs, the way they reverse letters, how long it takes them to process words, the way Michael shuts down when he's overwhelmed, the way Victor can't sit still because his brain needs movement to focus." She paused. "I recognized it because I have it too." Anthony's eyes flickered. Surprise, maybe disbelief. She kept going. "I failed out of 3 schools before I turned 18. Teachers told me I'd never amount to anything, that I was slow, lazy, wasting everyone's time." Her voice steadied. "I didn't learn to read properly until I was 23. A woman at a community literacy program taught me using the same methods I used with your sons." She leaned forward slightly, her hands gripping the edge of the chair. "Mr. Smith, your boys aren't failing because they're not trying. They're failing because nobody's taught them in the language their brains actually speak. Every tutor you hired taught the same way, the way that works for most kids. But not for them. Not for brains like theirs." Anthony was quiet. His fingers drummed once against the desk, then stopped. He turned his laptop screen toward her. Security footage. The sunroom camera. His sons laughing. Engaged. Confident. Learning. "I haven't seen them smile like that since." His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "Since their mother died." Catherine's chest tightened. Anthony stood abruptly, walked to the window, stood there with his back to her, shoulders rigid. "I thought if I pushed harder," he said, voice low, "hired better tutors, spent more money, I thought I could fix them." He turned around, and for the first time, Catherine saw it. The grief, the guilt, the weight of a father who'd been drowning and didn't know how to ask for help. "But they were never broken, were they?" "No," Catherine whispered. "They never were." Anthony crossed his arms, looked at her really, looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. "I need you to teach me what you're doing." Catherine blinked. "Sir? Teach me." His voice was raw, desperate. "Teach me how to see my own sons." Anthony didn't sleep that night. Catherine left his office around 7, quietly, still unsure if she had a job in the morning. The boys had already eaten dinner with Mrs. Patterson mac and cheese, their favorite, and been sent upstairs to bed early. The house fell into its usual evening silence. But Anthony's office light stayed on. He sat at his desk, laptop glowing in the darkness, and started searching. Dyslexia symptoms in children. Dyslexia versus learning disability. How to recognize dyslexia in twins. Article after article. Research study after research study. Videos of children learning to read using colored overlays. Testimonials from parents who'd spent years thinking their kids were lazy, unmotivated, broken. The words on the screen blurred together. He clicked on a diagnostic checklist. "Does your child reverse letters like B and dood?" "Yes." Michael did that constantly. "Does your child avoid reading aloud?" "Yes, both of them." "Does your child have difficulty with spelling, even simple words?" "Yes." "Does your child seem intelligent in conversation but struggle with written work?" Anthony's hand stopped moving on the mouse. "Yes." "God?" "Yes." They could talk about anything: space, dinosaurs, how engines worked. They asked questions that stunned him sometimes with their depth, but put a worksheet in front of them, and they shut down completely. He kept reading. One article mentioned that dyslexia often went undiagnosed in children from wealthy families because parents could afford tutors who just worked harder, pushed longer, drilled the same methods over and over without ever asking why the child wasn't learning. Anthony's stomach turned. He opened another tab, searched for the tutors he'd hired over the past 2 years. Not one of them specialized in learning disabilities. Not one. He'd spent $50,000 on people who were teaching his sons the wrong way, and he'd blamed Michael and Victor for not trying hard enough. His throat tightened. He pulled up the security footage again, watched his sons in the sunroom with Catherine. Really watched this time. The way Michael's whole face changed when he traced letters in the shaving cream, the joy in Victor's voice as he paced and read without stumbling, the way they looked at Catherine not like a housekeeper, not like a tutor, like someone who saw them. Anthony's hands started shaking. He pushed away from the desk, stood up, paced to the window, stared out at the dark yard, the pool lights reflecting off the water. Rebecca's face came to him, the way she used to watch the boys when they were younger, that crease between her eyebrows when she was worried about something. "Anthony, I think something's different about how they learn," she'd said once, maybe a year before the accident. "I don't think they're just being difficult." He'd brushed it off, told her they were fine, just needed more discipline, more structure. And then she died. And he never got to tell her she was right. His chest cracked open. He sank into the chair by the window, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time since the funeral, Anthony Smith let himself break. He cried for his sons, for the years he'd spent pushing them when he should have been listening, for Rebecca, who'd known something was wrong and never got the chance to fix it, for every time he'd made his boys feel like failures when they were just trying to survive. By dawn, Anthony's eyes were swollen and dry. He hadn't slept, hadn't moved from the chair except to pour himself coffee that had gone cold hours ago. But he'd made a decision. At 7:30, he called his assistant. "Cancel everything for the next 2 weeks. I don't care what it is. Cancel it." At 8, he found Catherine in the kitchen, washing breakfast dishes. She turned when she heard his footsteps, her face guarded. He must have looked like hell. He felt like it. "I stayed up all night," he said, his voice rough, "reading about dyslexia, about how kids like mine." He stopped, corrected himself, "about how my sons learn." Catherine set down the dish she was holding. "I need to get them tested," Anthony continued, "professionally, by someone who actually knows what they're looking at." "That's good," Catherine said softly. "That's really good. And I need you there." He looked at her directly. "When they do the testing, when we get the results, I need you to help me understand what it all means." Catherine hesitated. "Mr. Smith, I'm not a doctor. I'm not even a teacher. You're the only person who's seen them." His voice broke slightly. "Really seen them. And I need you to teach me how to do that." She studied his face for a long moment, saw the exhaustion, the regret, the desperate hope of a father who'd finally stopped running. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll help." Anthony nodded, turned to leave, then stopped. "Catherine?" She looked up. "Thank you." His voice was barely a whisper. "For not giving up on them when I almost did." He walked out before she could respond. Catherine stood alone in the kitchen, her hands still wet from the dishes, tears sliding down her face. For the first time since she'd arrived at this house, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, God had put her exactly where she was supposed to be. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived on a Tuesday morning. Anthony had hired the best educational psychologist in the state, someone who specialized in learning disabilities, who'd worked with hundreds of children like his sons. Catherine watched from the kitchen window as the doctor pulled up in a silver sedan, carrying a leather bag and a calm expression that suggested she'd seen this 1,000 times before. The twins were already nervous. They'd barely touched their breakfast. "What if she says we're stupid?" Michael whispered to Catherine while she cleared their plates. Catherine knelt beside his chair, looked him straight in the eyes. "She won't, because you're not. But what if the tests say, the tests are going to show what I already know?" Her voice was steady. "Sure, that your brains are brilliant. They just work differently." Victor stood by the window, arms crossed, watching his father talk to Dr. Chen on the front steps. "He looks scared," Victor said quietly. Catherine glanced out. Anthony's shoulders were tense, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, a posture she'd never seen on him before. "He is," she said, "but not of you. He's scared he missed this for too long." Victor turned to look at her. "You think he feels bad?" "I think he feels everything." The testing took 6 hours. Dr. Chen set up in the library, spreading assessment materials across the table, puzzles, reading passages, memory games, pattern recognition tasks. The boys went in separately, Michael first, then Victor. Anthony and Catherine waited in his office. Neither of them knew what to do with the silence. Catherine sat on the edge of the couch, hands folded in her lap, trying not to watch the clock. Anthony stood by the window, pretending to read emails on his phone, but she could see he wasn't actually looking at the screen. An hour passed, then 2. "Do you think they're okay in there?" Anthony finally asked, his voice tight. "Dr. Chen knows what she's doing," Catherine said. "And the boys are stronger than you think." Anthony turned to look at her. "Really look at her? You care about them?" It wasn't a question, just an observation. Catherine met his eyes. "Yes." "Why?" The question hung in the air between them. Catherine thought about lying, about saying something polite and distant, but she was tired of pretending she didn't feel what she felt. "Because nobody cared about me," she said quietly. "When I was their age, when I was failing and teachers were giving up, and I thought I was the problem." Her voice caught. "Nobody fought for me. Nobody looked closer. And I spent 15 years believing I was broken." She looked down at her hands. "I don't want them to spend 15 years believing that." Anthony was quiet for a long time. Then he crossed the room and sat down in the chair across from her, not behind his desk, not standing above her, just there, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face. "I'm sorry," he said. Catherine looked up, confused. "For what?" "For whatever they did to you. Whoever made you feel that way." His jaw tightened. "And for almost doing the same thing to my sons. You didn't know?" "I should have." His voice was raw, honest. "Rebecca tried to tell me, and I didn't listen. I was too busy, too distracted, too convinced that if I just pushed hard enough, everything would fall into place." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I've spent 3 years trying to be both parents, trying to fill the space she left, and I've failed at all of it." "You haven't failed," Catherine said softly. "You're here now. That's what matters." "Is it?" "Yes." They sat in the quiet after that, not uncomfortable, just present. Two people who'd both been broken in different ways, waiting to see if they could help two boys avoid the same fate. Around 4 o'clock, Dr. Chen knocked on the office door. Anthony stood so fast he nearly knocked over his chair. "Come in." Dr. Chen stepped inside, her expression calm but serious. She carried a folder thick with papers. "Mr. Smith, Miss Walsh." She nodded to both of them. "The boys did beautifully. They're resting in the kitchen with some snacks." "And?" Anthony's voice was barely steady. Dr. Chen set the folder on the desk, opened it to the first page of results. "Both boys have superior IQ scores," she began. "Michael tested at 127, Victor at 129. Anthony's breath caught. "They also both have severe dyslexia and ADHD, Dr. Chen continued. "Classic presentation. The kind that's often missed because the child is intelligent enough to compensate for years before the system catches up." She turned another page, showing charts and graphs that meant nothing to Catherine but everything to Anthony. "They're currently reading at a 2nd grade level, despite being in 3rd grade. Their processing speed for written language is significantly delayed. But," she looked up at both of them, "the coping strategies they're using are remarkable, graduate-level interventions." Dr. Chen's eyes settled on Catherine. "Who's been working with them?" Anthony gestured toward Catherine. "She has." Dr. Chen studied her with new interest. "Miss Walsh, have you worked with dyslexic children before?" Catherine shook her head. "Just one. Me." Dr. Chen's eyebrows lifted. She smiled, the kind of smile that held respect. "Then you have an intuitive understanding that most special education teachers spend years trying to develop." She closed the folder. "These boys are lucky to have you." Catherine's throat tightened. She couldn't speak. Anthony's hand found the back of his chair, gripping it like he needed something to hold him upright. "So what do we do now?" he asked. Dr. Chen looked between them. "You keep doing exactly what you're doing, and you fight like hell to make sure their school does the same." The call came, 3 days later, Anthony was in a meeting when his assistant knocked on his office door, her face apologetic. "Mr. Smith, Ashford Academy is on the line. The headmaster says it's urgent." Anthony excused himself, stepped into the hallway, pressed the phone to his ear. "Mr. Smith, this is Headmaster Whitmore. We need to schedule a meeting regarding Michael and Victor. Tomorrow, if possible." Something in the man's tone made Anthony's spine stiffen. "What's this about?" "It's better discussed in person. Can you come in at 9? Anthony agreed, hung up, stood there in the empty hallway with dread settling like stone in his gut. That evening, he told Catherine. She was folding laundry in the utility room, the twins upstairs doing homework they were actually completing now, with colored overlays and extra time. "The school wants to meet," Anthony said from the doorway. Catherine looked up, her hands stilling on a towel. "Did they say why?" "No, but I can guess." Catherine set the towel down. "You want me to come?" Anthony hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I do." Ashford Academy sat on 15 acres of manicured grounds, all brick buildings and ivy-covered walls. The kind of school that prided itself on legacy, excellence, and test scores that kept it ranked in the top 5% nationally. Anthony had donated $2 million over the past 3 years. His name was on a library wing. None of that mattered when he and Catherine walked into Headmaster Whitmore's office the next morning. Whitmore was a tall man in his 60s, silver-haired and polished, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. He stood when they entered, gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Mr. Smith, thank you for coming." Anthony didn't sit. "What's this about?" Whitmore's smile thinned. "Please, sit. This won't take long." Anthony sat. Catherine stayed standing by the door until Anthony looked back at her, nodded toward the empty chair beside him. She sat. Whitmore folded his hands on his desk. "Mr. Smith, we've been reviewing Michael and Victor's academic progress, or lack thereof, and the board has made a recommendation, which is, we believe it would be in the boys' best interest to repeat 3rd grade, or alternatively, transfer to an institution better equipped to handle their special needs." The words landed like a slap. Anthony's jaw tightened. "Special needs? They've failed multiple assessments, Mr. Smith. Their reading and writing scores are significantly below grade level. Ashford Academy maintains a standard of excellence, and my sons have dyslexia." Anthony pulled Dr. Chen's report from his bag, dropped it on the desk, "and ADHD, both diagnosed by one of the top educational psychologists in the state." Whitmore glanced at the report, but didn't pick it up. "Yes, well, that's precisely why we're recommending a transfer. We're not a special education facility." "They don't need a special education facility." Anthony's voice was rising now. "They need teachers who understand how they learn. Mr. Smith, with all due respect, Ashford has a reputation to maintain. Our test scores—" "Your test scores?" Anthony leaned forward. "You're talking about kicking out my sons because of your test scores?" Whitmore's expression hardened. "We have standards. Your son's performance affects our rankings, our college placement statistics. They're 8 years old." "Yes, and already 2 years behind." Catherine's hands gripped the arms of her chair. She wanted to speak but didn't know if she had the right. Anthony saw her hesitation, looked at Whitmore. "Miss Walsh has been working with my sons. In 2 weeks, they've made more progress than they did in 2 years of your teaching." Whitmore's eyes flicked to Catherine, dismissive. "Miss Walsh is your housekeeper, correct?" Catherine felt the words like a blade. "Yes," she said quietly. "Then I'm sure she means well. But," Whitmore smiled condescendingly, "she's not a certified educator. Her methods, while perhaps well-intentioned, aren't relevant to this proceeding." Something in Anthony's expression went cold. He stood slowly. "Then, let me be clear, Headmaster. I'm withdrawing both my sons from Ashford Academy, effective immediately." Whitmore blinked. "Mr. Smith, I don't think you understand. And I'm withdrawing my $2 million annual donor pledge." The room went silent. Whitmore's face paled. "Now, let's not be hasty. I'm also telling every parent I know exactly why." Anthony's voice was steady now, certain, that this school would rather protect its rankings than teach children how to learn. He turned to Catherine. "Let's go." Catherine stood, her legs shaking. Anthony walked to the door, then stopped, looked back at Whitmore. "My sons don't need a different school. They need people who actually see them, and if you can't do that, then you don't deserve to teach anyone's children." He walked out. Catherine followed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. They didn't speak until they reached the parking lot. Anthony stood by his car, hands braced on the hood, breathing hard. Catherine waited, didn't know what to say. Finally, Anthony looked up at her. "Did I just ruin my son's education?" "No," Catherine said softly. "You just saved it." His eyes filled. He turned away, wiping at his face with the back of his hand. "I should have done that 2 years ago. You did it now. That's what matters." They stood there in the morning sun, two people who'd just burned a bridge and had no idea where the road led next. But for the first time in years, Anthony felt something he hadn't felt since Rebecca died. Hope. Anthony couldn't find the twins' baby books. He'd been searching the house for 2 days, wanting to show Dr. Chen their early development records. Catherine had offered to help, moving through storage closets and spare rooms with quiet efficiency. They ended up in the attic. Dust floated through beams of afternoon light. Boxes stacked on boxes, years of life packed away and forgotten. Catherine pulled open a container labeled Rebecca, Personal. Inside, journals, dozens of them. Anthony froze when he saw them. "I didn't know she kept these," he whispered. Catherine started to close the box, sensing she'd stepped into something sacred. But Anthony reached past her, lifted one out. The leather was worn, the pages dog-eared. He opened it to a random entry. His hands started shaking. "What is it?" Catherine asked softly. He didn't answer, just kept reading, his face going pale. Then he sank onto an old trunk, the journal open in his lap. Catherine waited, didn't move, barely breathed. "She knew," Anthony finally said, his voice breaking. Rebecca knew something was wrong. He turned the journal toward Catherine. "Let her read." March 15th. "Michael reversed his B's and D's again today. The teacher says he's not paying attention. But I watched him." Anthony. "He was paying attention. He just can't see them the right way. I need to get them tested. I need to understand what's happening before they start believing they're failing." Catherine's throat closed. Anthony flipped forward. Another entry. June 3rd. "Victor can't sit still during reading time. His teacher called it behavioral issues. But when I let him walk around while I read to him, he remembered every word, every single word. There's something here, something everyone's missing." Another page. September 12th. "I've been researching dyslexia. Everything I'm reading sounds like my boys. I'm calling that specialist next week. Anthony thinks I'm worrying too much. But I know my sons. I know something's different." The date on that entry was 2 weeks before she died. Anthony's shoulders started shaking. Catherine knelt beside him, her hand hovering near his arm, unsure if she should touch him. "She tried to tell me," he whispered. "I remember that conversation. I told her they were fine, that she was overthinking it." His voice cracked completely. "And then she was gone, and I spent 3 years pushing them the same way everyone else did." Tears streamed down his face. "I failed her. I failed them." "No." Catherine's voice was firm. She grabbed his hand without thinking. "You didn't know. You were grieving. You were trying to survive. I should have listened. She would forgive you." Catherine squeezed his hand. "And your sons already have." Anthony looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes red and raw. "How do you know?" "Because I see the way they look at you now." Her voice softened. "They don't see a man who failed them. They see their father trying. And that's everything." They sat there in the dusty attic light, his hand still in hers, surrounded by boxes of a life that was gone but not forgotten. After a long moment, Anthony pulled another journal from the box, opened it near the end, found an entry dated a month before Rebecca's death. His breath caught. "Listen to this," he said, his voice barely steady. Catherine leaned closer. "October 8th. I had the most beautiful dream last night. Anthony and I opened a learning center for children like ours, a place where kids who learn differently aren't made to feel broken, where teachers actually see them. We called it Hope House. I know it sounds impossible, but maybe one day, when the boys are older, when we understand their needs better, maybe we could do something. Maybe we could help other families who feel as lost as we do right now." Anthony closed the journal carefully, set it on top of the box, covered his face with both hands, and broke. Not the quiet tears from before. This was deeper, years of grief and guilt and regret pouring out of him in waves. Catherine didn't say anything, just stayed beside him, let him shatter, let him feel it all. When he finally looked up, his voice was raw but certain. "We're going to build it." Catherine blinked. "What?" "Her dream. The learning center." He looked at her with eyes that were still wet but suddenly clear. "We're going to build it for her, for our sons, for every child who needs someone to see them. Anthony." She'd never used his first name before. It slipped out without thinking. That's a huge thing." "I know." He stood, still holding Rebecca's journal. "But you're going to help me. You're going to run it." "I can't. I'm not." "You're exactly who should." He turned to face her fully. "You understand these kids because you were one of them. That's worth more than any degree. But I don't have credentials." "I don't have." "Then we'll get you credentials." His voice was steady now, determined. "I'll pay for your education, whatever it takes. You'll go to school, get your degree, your teaching certification, and when you're ready, we'll open the center together." Catherine stared at him, her mind reeling. "Why would you do that for me?" Anthony's expression softened. "Because you did something for my sons that no one else could. You saw them. And maybe," his voice caught, "maybe that's what Rebecca's been trying to tell me all along, that the people who save us aren't always the ones with the biggest credentials. Sometimes they're just the ones who know what it's like to be broken." Catherine's eyes filled. For the first time in her life, someone was offering her more than she'd ever dared to dream, and she was terrified. But she whispered anyway, "Okay." Catherine sat alone in her room that night, staring at the laptop Anthony had given her. A new laptop, still in the box, for school applications. She'd opened it an hour ago, created an account, pulled up the website for the local community college, but her hands wouldn't move. The cursor blinked in the empty text box. "Tell us about yourself." Catherine had no idea where to start. She was 28 years old, high school dropout, former foster kid who'd lived in her car, a woman who cleaned other people's houses for a living. Who was she to think she could become a teacher? Her finger hovered over the keyboard. Then she closed the laptop, put her head in her hands, and let herself feel the weight of what she'd agreed to. Downstairs, Anthony couldn't sleep either. He sat in the living room, Rebecca's journals spread across the coffee table in front of him. He'd been reading them for hours, learning his wife all over again through her words. She'd been scared too, scared of getting it wrong, scared of failing their sons. But she'd written it anyway, dreamed it anyway. "Maybe we could help other families who feel as lost as we do right now." Anthony traced the words with his finger. "I'm sorry I didn't listen," he whispered into the empty room. "I'm sorry I waited so long." The house settled around him. Quiet, still, but not lonely. Not anymore. Upstairs, he heard footsteps. Catherine, moving around in her room. He wondered if she was as terrified as he was. The next morning, Catherine came down early to start breakfast. She found Anthony already in the kitchen, coffee brewing, the twins' lunchboxes lined up on the counter. He looked up when she walked in. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "No." She moved to the sink, started washing her hands out of habit, even though there was nothing to clean yet. "You?" "Not really." They stood there in the pre-dawn quiet, two people who'd promised each other something impossible and were now facing the reality of it. "I don't know if I can do this," Catherine said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Anthony set down his coffee cup. "What part?" "Any of it." She turned to face him. "College, teaching, running a center. I failed out of school 3 times, Anthony. What if I fail again?" "You won't. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." He moved closer. "Because this time, you're not doing it alone. And this time, you actually want it." Catherine's eyes filled. "What if I'm not good enough?" "You already are." His voice was steady. "Sure. My sons are proof of that." She looked down, trying to blink back tears. Anthony hesitated, then reached out and gently lifted her chin, so she had to meet his eyes. "Catherine, you spent your whole life being told you weren't enough, but you are. You always have been, and I need you to start believing that." A tear slipped down her cheek. "I'm scared." "So am I." He dropped his hand. "I'm terrified I'll mess this up, that I'll fail Rebecca's dream, that I'll let my sons down again." "You won't." "Then we won't." He smiled slightly. "We'll just have to be scared together." Footsteps sounded on the stairs. The twins appeared in the doorway, hair messy, still in their pajamas. "Why are you both up so early?" Michael asked, rubbing his eyes. Catherine quickly wiped her face. Just making breakfast. Victor studied them both with the kind of knowing look that 8-year-olds sometimes have. Were you crying? Catherine started to deny it, but Anthony spoke first. We were talking about big changes. Sometimes, big changes are scary. Michael walked over to Catherine, wrapped his arms around her waist. Is it good scary or bad scary? Catherine's throat tightened. She knelt down so she was eye level with him. Good scary, she said softly. The kind that means something beautiful might happen if we're brave enough. Victor came closer. Are you going somewhere? No, sweetheart. I'm staying. But I'm going to go to school, to learn how to be a real teacher. You're already a real teacher, Victor said matter-of-factly. Michael nodded. The best one we ever had. Catherine pulled them both into a hug, her eyes closing against fresh tears. Over their heads, she met Anthony's gaze. He was watching them with an expression she couldn't quite name. Grief and gratitude mixed together, love for his sons, and something else, something that looked almost like hope. Pancakes? He asked quietly. Catherine smiled through her tears. Pancakes. That afternoon, Catherine opened the laptop again. This time, she started typing. My name is Catherine Walsh. I learned to read at 23 years old. For most of my life, I believed I was broken, that my brain didn't work the way it was supposed to, that I would never be more than I was. Then I met 2 boys who were breaking the same way I once did, and I realized something. I wasn't broken. I was just learning in a language no one had taught me yet. I want to become a teacher so I can be for other children what no one was for me, someone who sees them, really sees them, not as problems to fix, but as people who just need someone to believe in them first. She paused, read it over, then hit submit before fear could stop her. The application went through. Catherine closed the laptop slowly, put her hand over her heart and felt it beating hard and fast, and whispered a prayer she hadn't prayed in years. God, if this is real, if this is what you want from me, please don't let me fall. The house was quiet around her, but somewhere deep inside, where faith lives even when you've forgotten it's there, she felt something settle, not certainty, but peace. And for now, that was enough. 4 months passed like breathing. Catherine enrolled in community college, night classes, online courses, weekends buried in textbooks while the twins did their homework beside her at the kitchen table. Some nights she wanted to quit, stared at essays she'd rewritten 5 times and still didn't think were good enough, called herself foolish for thinking she could do this at 28 when she'd failed so completely at 18. But then Michael would look up from his reading and say, "You spelled that wrong," pointing at her paper with a grin, and she'd laugh. Fix it. Keep going. The twins transferred to a small progressive school across town. Smaller classes. Teachers trained in learning differences. Accommodations written into their education plans. Extra time, colored overlays, oral testing options. Within 6 weeks, both boys passed their first full exam. Catherine was there when Anthony got the email from their teacher. Watched his face go still, then crumble, then light up all at once. He showed her the screen with shaking hands. Michael, 87%. Victor, 92%. They did it, he whispered. They actually did it. Catherine's eyes filled. They always could. They just needed someone to let them. That night, Anthony took them all out to dinner. A real celebration. The twins ordered dessert first, laughing when the waiter pretended to be shocked. Catherine sat across from Anthony, watching him with his sons really present with them for the first time since she'd met him, laughing at their jokes, listening to their stories about school, asking questions that showed he actually cared about the answers. This was what healing looked like. Not perfect, not finished, but real. By winter, the plans for the learning center were underway. Anthony had purchased an old Victorian house on the edge of town, 3 stories, wraparound porch, big windows that let in light from every direction. It needed work, but the bones were good. He brought Catherine to see it on a Saturday morning. They stood in the empty front room, sunlight streaming through dusty windows, their breath visible in the cold air. "What do you think?" Anthony asked. Catherine turned slowly, taking it in. The high ceilings, the hardwood floors that creaked under her feet, the built-in shelves that could hold books. "It's perfect," she whispered. "Each room will be different," Anthony said, his voice filling with something she'd never heard from him before: excitement. Sensory spaces, movement zones, quiet areas for kids who need stillness. Everything designed around how different brains actually learn. He pulled out architectural sketches, showed her the plans. Catherine looked at the drawings, her heart swelling in her chest. When can we open? A year, maybe less if construction goes smoothly. He looked at her. Will you be ready? Catherine thought about her college classes, the teaching credential she was working toward, the fear that still woke her up some nights. I don't know, she said honestly, but I'll try. That's all anyone can do. They walked through the empty house together, mapping out rooms in their minds. The twins ran ahead, their voices echoing through the hollow spaces, calling out which room they wanted to help decorate. In what would become the main learning area, Catherine stopped, placed her hand on the window frame. Rebecca would love this, she said quietly. Anthony came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She does, he said. I think she's been watching this whole time, making sure we got it right. Catherine looked at him, saw the peace in his face that hadn't been there 6 months ago. You miss her? Every day. His voice was steady. But I'm not drowning in it anymore. And I think, he paused, I think she'd be okay with that. They stood in the winter light, surrounded by the skeleton of a dream that was slowly becoming real. What should we call it? Catherine asked. Anthony smiled, pulled a small notebook from his pocket, one of Rebecca's journals, opened to a page near the end. Hope House. Catherine's breath caught. She already named it, Anthony said softly. Years ago. We're just catching up. That evening, back at the house, Catherine found a letter in her mailbox. Her hands shook as she opened it. Dear Miss Walsh, congratulations. You have been accepted into the special education credential program beginning next fall. She read it 3 times, then walked inside, found Anthony in his office, and handed him the letter without a word. He read it, looked up at her, smiled wider than she'd ever seen. You did it. We did it, she corrected. The twins appeared in the doorway, sensing something important. What happened? Victor asked. Catherine knelt down, pulled them both close. I'm going to be a real teacher, an official one. Michael's face lit up. Does that mean you can teach more kids like us? Yes, baby. That's exactly what it means. Victor looked at his father. Is the center really going to happen? Anthony nodded. It's really going to happen. And kids like us won't have to feel stupid anymore. Catherine's throat closed. No, sweetheart, they won't. Because we're going to show them what I showed you, that different doesn't mean broken. Michael threw his arms around her neck. You saved us, he whispered. Catherine held him tight, tears streaming down her face. No, baby, you saved me. 2 years later, the morning of the grand opening, Catherine stood in the center of what used to be an empty Victorian house and was now Hope House Learning Center. Everything was ready. Sensory rooms painted in soft colors, movement spaces with balance beams and yoga mats, quiet corners with beanbags and weighted blankets, shelves lined with books in every format, audiobooks, large print, graphic novels, colored overlays organized by shade, textured letters, art supplies, every tool a different kind of learner might need. And in the main entrance, a portrait of Rebecca Smith, her smile warm, her eyes kind. Beneath it, a plaque, for every child who was told they couldn't, and for every person who helped them see they could. Catherine traced the words with her finger. She'd be so proud of you, a voice said behind her. She turned. Anthony stood in the doorway, wearing a suit but looking more relaxed than she'd ever seen him. The twins flanked him on either side, 10 years old now, taller, confident, holding a ribbon for the ceremony. I hope so, Catherine said softly. I know so. Anthony walked closer. You turned her dream into something real. We did, Catherine corrected. All of us. Michael looked up at his mother's portrait. I wish she could see this. She can, Victor said quietly. I think she's been watching the whole time. By 9 o'clock, families started arriving. 47 children enrolled for the first semester. Each one carrying a story like the twins had carried years of being told they weren't trying hard enough, weren't smart enough, weren't enough. Catherine greeted them at the door, not as a housekeeper anymore. As Director Catherine Walsh, certified special education teacher, the woman who'd built this place from nothing but pain and hope. One mother approached her, holding the hand of a small girl, maybe 7 years old, with red eyes and hunched shoulders. This is Emma, the mother said, her voice breaking. She told me last week she doesn't want to be alive anymore because she's too stupid for school. Catherine's heart cracked open. She knelt in front of Emma, waiting until the girl looked at her. "Hi, Emma. My name is Catherine, and I want to tell you something really important." She kept her voice gentle, steady. "I didn't learn to read until I was 23 years old. Do you know how old that is?" Emma shook her head. "Really, really old," Catherine said with a small smile. "Everyone told me I'd never be able to do it, that I wasn't smart enough, but they were wrong. My brain just needed different tools, and I think your brain might be the same." Emma's lip trembled. "Really? Really?" Catherine reached into her pocket, pulled out a green overlay. "Want to try something?" Emma nodded, barely. Catherine led her to a reading corner, opened a book, placed the overlay on the page. "Try now." Emma looked down. Her eyes widened. "The letters, they're not jumping as much." "That's your brain finding its language," Catherine said softly. Emma read the first sentence, stumbled once, kept going. By the third sentence, she was reading clearly. When she finished the paragraph, she looked up at Catherine with tears streaming down her face. "I did it." "You did," Catherine whispered, "and you're going to do it again, and again, until you stop being surprised by how brilliant you are." Emma threw her arms around Catherine's neck. Behind them, the mother covered her mouth, sobbing. Anthony watched from across the room, his own eyes wet. The ribbon-cutting ceremony happened at noon. Catherine stood beside Anthony on the front porch, the twins between them, holding giant scissors. Reporters had come, local news cameras, parents and children filling the yard. Anthony spoke first. "My wife Rebecca believed every child deserves to be seen for who they are, not who they can't be. She knew our sons needed something different. And if she were here, she'd tell you that this center exists because one woman saw what everyone else missed, that different doesn't mean less." He turned to Catherine, his voice thick with emotion. "Catherine, you didn't just save my sons. You honored my wife's dream in ways I never could have alone. Thank you." Catherine's throat tightened. She looked out at the crowd, at all the families who'd come, at Emma standing with her mother, at the twins smiling up at her. "I spent most of my life believing I was broken," she said, her voice carrying across the yard. "That God had made some kind of mistake when he made me. But standing here today, I know the truth. I wasn't broken. I was just being prepared. For this. For them." She gestured to the children. "Every child here deserves to know they're not failing. They're not lazy. They're not stupid. They're just learning in a different language. And we're going to teach them that language. We're going to show them they're not alone." Michael and Victor cut the ribbon together. It fell in 2 pieces, and Hope House opened its doors. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Catherine walked through the quiet building one last time. She stopped in front of Rebecca's portrait. "Thank you," she whispered, "for dreaming this, for believing in your boys when no one else did, for somehow making sure I ended up exactly where I needed to be." She felt a hand on her shoulder. "Anthony, she brought you to us," he said quietly. "I'm sure of it." Catherine turned to face him. "Do you really believe that?" "I do." His eyes held hers. "Some people come into your life exactly when you need them. Not a moment sooner, not a moment later. Just right on time." They stood close in the dimming light, 2 people who'd been broken in different ways and had somehow found healing in helping others. "Thank you," Catherine said, "for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." "Thank you," Anthony replied, "for teaching me how to see my own children." Outside, the sun was setting. Golden light poured through the windows, filling every corner of Hope House with warmth. And somewhere in the silence between heartbeats, in the space where grief becomes grace, Catherine felt it. That whisper she'd heard 2 years ago in a kitchen, holding 2 broken boys. "This is why you're here." She closed her eyes. And finally, after 28 years of feeling invisible, Catherine Walsh let herself believe what she'd spent her whole life trying to find. She was seen. She always had been. And now, she'd spend the rest of her life making sure every child who walked through these doors knew they were seen too. Not despite being different, but because being different was exactly what made them beautiful. He had given up. After doctors, treatments, therapists, after years of waiting for something to change, nothing ever did. His twin boys were blind. That's what the world told him. That's what he believed. The house was always quiet. Until that afternoon, when he heard something that didn't belong there. Laughter. At first, he thought it was the wind, Or maybe the TV left on in another room. But the sound came again, soft, sweet, strange. He stood up, heart pounding, unsure why he suddenly felt nervous. He walked down the hallway, slowly, listening, searching. And then he saw it, the light under the door. The playroom. The one no one used. The one that had been silent for years. The door was open, just a crack. And through it, he thought he saw her. The maid, kneeling by the tub, with his boys. And for a moment, he forgot how to breathe. Joy Thompson didn't ask for much. She came to the Walker estate looking for steady work. She wasn't expecting warmth. She wasn't looking for connection. The house was large, cold, too clean like it had been frozen in time. Curtains always drawn. Lights dimmed low. Rooms that echoed when no one spoke. Charles Walker barely looked at her the day she arrived. His voice was polite, distant. His eyes? Tired in a way that didn't come from work, but from loss. His sons, Gabriel and Michael, were just over 2. Beautiful, silent, unmoving. The file said they were blind from birth. No treatment had worked. No progress had ever come. Joy was told not to expect anything. Not reactions, not play, not light. But something about those boys stirred something in her. She couldn't name it, but she felt it. And one morning, while washing their faces, she saw something no one else had ever seen. Sometimes, what breaks you becomes the doorway to what heals you. This isn't just a story about sight. It's a story about grief, about silence, and about how love, real love, sees what others overlook. If you've ever felt like hope passed your house by, or if you've ever been the one who noticed something no one else did, then this story is for you. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and who in your life truly saw you when no one else did? Because sometimes, the miracle doesn't come through a doctor or a cure. Sometimes, it walks into the room quietly, wipes a child's face, and pays attention. The first morning, the house felt colder than the air outside. Joy Thompson stood at the edge of the long hallway, holding her breath without meaning to. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that feels like it's been there too long. Like grief had unpacked its bags and made itself at home. The floors didn't creak. The walls didn't speak. Even the light, what little there was, felt like it didn't have permission to move. She hadn't seen Mr. Walker since he greeted her briefly the night before. No handshake, just a nod, a few clipped instructions, and then he was gone. He hadn't stepped into the nursery, hadn't looked at the boys. She understood, in her own way. Some pain makes you disappear, even when you're still standing in the room. The boys were already awake when she entered, sitting in matching cribs, dressed in soft grey clothes, their eyes fixed on nothing. Gabriel and Michael, 2 years and 4 months old, pale skin, dark lashes, small hands resting quietly in their laps. They didn't cry, didn't reach, didn't react. She whispered their names anyway. No answer. The only sound in the room was the quiet rustle of the curtains behind her, heavy, lined, always drawn. She began the day's routine, just as the schedule listed. Breakfast, sponge bath, change of clothes, tidy the space. She moved slowly, giving them time to adjust to her presence. Not that they seemed to notice. Later, with the water warm in the tub and soft towels laid out, she lifted Michael first. His body was light, too light. She held him carefully, one hand supporting his back, the other gently cupping his head. He didn't resist, didn't flinch. He just sat there in the shallow water, quiet as ever. Joy rolled her sleeves up, dipped the washcloth in the water, and began to clean his face. And then it happened. A bead of soap slid toward his eye, and for the briefest moment, maybe a second, maybe less, his eyelid fluttered. She paused. It could have been reflex, a twitch, nothing. But something in her gut told her not to move. She stayed there, one hand in the water, her breath caught somewhere between fear and wonder. Then, slowly, she looked over at Gabriel. He was staring off, as always, but just behind him, The bathroom mirror caught a sliver of light. The sun had moved, just slightly, and now a soft line of brightness spilled across the tile. She adjusted the faucet without thinking, angling the chrome just enough for the reflection to shift. The light skimmed across the floor, across the edge of the tub, and stopped near Gabriel's toes. He turned his head. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate, just a few inches enough to follow the light. Joy blinked, heart thudding, her hands stilled in the water. She didn't say anything. She didn't move. She just watched. And then Michael did it again, that flutter. A soft blink, a blink that had nothing to do with sound and everything to do with light. Her chest tightened. It wasn't proof. Not yet. But it wasn't nothing. She finished the bath quietly, her movements gentle, steady, as though afraid to disturb something sacred. When she lifted the boys out and wrapped them in towels, she kissed their heads without thinking. They didn't respond. But she felt something shift in the room. Later, after they were dressed and settled, Joy walked into the hallway and looked out the nearest window. The sky was pale blue. The garden outside was still. And inside this house, something had just woken up. She didn't tell anyone what she saw. Not yet. She didn't trust herself to name it. But that night, when she was alone in the small room they'd given her, she opened a notebook she hadn't used in months. She wrote just 4 words. Michael blinked at light. Then she set the pen down, closed the book, and whispered a prayer into the quiet. God, if I'm wrong, stop me. But if I'm right, help me see what you see. There was a quiet rhythm to the days in the Walker house. It wasn't peace, not really. It was more like the stillness that follows loss. A house that learned to survive by not expecting anything new. Joy never asked questions. She moved through the rooms with soft steps and steady hands, learning the routines, reading between the silences. The twins stayed quiet too. No tantrums, no giggles. Just 2 small boys sitting in a sunless nursery, surrounded by toys that never moved. But once you've seen something, you can't unsee it. That blink, the shift of the eyes, the turn of the head, it stayed with her. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. She found herself watching them more closely now. Not out of suspicion, but out of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, there was more happening beneath the stillness. One morning, as she changed their clothes, she swapped the boys' positions by the window. It was subtle. Gabriel, now closer to the light, squinted slightly as the curtains stirred. Michael reached out, not blindly, but towards something. She didn't write it down this time. She just watched and wondered. By the 3rd week, small details began to surface. She'd hum sometimes while folding laundry. Nothing special, just little things her grandmother used to sing in the kitchen. Old church melodies, pieces of memory. One afternoon, she was softly humming, "What a friend we have in Jesus," while tucking in the bedsheets, and she caught it. Gabriel turned his head toward her voice. Not the sound of the sheet, not the movement. Her voice. She paused, waited, then sang a little louder, just one line. Michael shifted. His fingers tapped the mattress beside him, almost like he was listening. No one else noticed. The housekeeper came and went. The gardener trimmed the hedge outside the nursery window. Charles Walker remained out of sight, his door always closed. But the boys were listening and responding. Bit by bit, Joy began to rearrange things. A lamp in the corner, a softer bulb. Curtains opened just a little, just enough for light to stretch across the floor in the late afternoon. She said nothing, but she watched, and the boys began to follow. Not every time, not always clearly, but enough. Enough to make her heart ache with questions. One evening, after the boys had been put to bed, Joy passed through the hallway and stopped by the linen closet. Something had been bothering her. The eye drops. They were part of the boys' care routine, prescribed, logged, administered at the same time every day. She'd been told they were for comfort, something to help with inflammation, keep the eyes from straining. But the more she watched, the more she noticed how still the boys became after the drops, almost like they withdrew. Even more than usual. She reached for the cabinet key the housekeeper always left hanging near the pantry. Hands steady, breath quiet, she opened the locked drawer where their supplies were kept. Rows of small bottles, labels she didn't recognize. She scanned the ingredients, the instructions, and there it was, in tiny print right beneath the dosage. May reduce photosensitivity temporarily, not for long-term pediatric use. She stared at the words, read them again, then closed the cabinet carefully, her thoughts racing. Why would a blind child, need something that reduced their sensitivity to light? That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling of the small guest room, her grandmother's voice echoing somewhere in her mind. You don't need a degree to pay attention. You just need to care enough to look twice. Joy didn't know what to do yet, but she knew this. Something wasn't right. And the boys, they were trying to speak in the only way they could, with blinks, with shifts, with silence that wasn't empty but full of something waiting to be seen. There were windows in every room, but none of them opened. They were framed in expensive wood, trimmed in thick velvet drapes, and always shut. Even on the sunniest days, the house stayed dim, cool, controlled. Joy noticed it more now. The way the morning light would try to peek through the edges of the curtains in the hallway and get swallowed by shadow. The way every lamp glowed just enough to see but never enough to feel warm. At first, she thought it was habit, then preference. But now, she wondered, what kind of home needs to keep light out? She started small. One afternoon, when the housekeeper was busy sorting invoices in the office, Joy slipped into the nursery and quietly pulled the curtain back 2 inches. The window was high, old, and a bit stiff, but the light poured in like it had been waiting years for permission. It stretched across the rug, a long golden stripe that touched the edge of the toy chest and spilled beneath Michael's crib. She said nothing. She just stepped back and watched. Michael blinked first, slowly. Then he turned his head, not sharply, but intentionally, as if something had brushed his awareness and he was reaching for it in the only way he knew how. Gabriel, who had been lying flat on his back, stirred. His eyes followed the light across the ceiling. Joy held her breath. Her heart thudded quietly in her chest. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't coincidence. This was response. And for the first time since she'd stepped into that house, she felt the weight of something heavy shift inside the room. Like a held breath, beginning to exhale. That night, she skipped the eye drops. Just for one boy. Just once. She waited until the house was quiet, the hallway still, the staff tucked into their corners. Then she stood at the nursery door, dropper in hand, and chose Gabriel. She gave Michael his dose as usual. But Gabriel, she simply held, whispering softly as she pressed a cool cloth to his forehead, pretending to follow the routine. Then she tucked him in. The next morning, the difference was subtle, but there. Michael was still, passive, his eyes dull. But Gabriel? He reached. Toward the mirror Joy had set near the window. It caught a shard of light from the hallway, and he reached. Joy bit her lip, hard. She couldn't say anything yet. Not to the staff. Not to Charles. But something had shifted. Later that week, she stood in the nursery, watching dust float through the beam of sunlight she'd allowed in. She glanced around, then walked to the cabinet again. This time, she opened the drawer slowly. Her hands didn't shake. Inside, the same rows of bottles. Different brands, different labels. But the same warning etched at the bottom of each one. May reduce photosensitivity. Not recommended for long-term pediatric use without supervision. And then tucked in the back she found a folder. Old prescriptions, shipping invoices, signatures, initials. The name printed at the bottom of every form? Dr. Ernest Vale. She didn't know the name, but something in her chest tightened when she saw it. All of it had been approved. Signed, ordered, repeated. For months. That evening, the quiet in the house felt different. Not peaceful, not routine. Heavy. She walked past Mr. Walker's study. His door was cracked slightly, not open, but not closed either. Inside, She could see him sitting by the fireplace, same posture, same stillness, a man who had learned to make peace with silence because it required nothing from him. Joy paused. She thought about saying something. About the light, the blink, the drops. But then she remembered the first day, how he hadn't even looked into the nursery, how the grief in his eyes wasn't sharp anymore, just settled, like a man who had made an agreement with heartbreak and stopped asking for more. So she kept walking, not because she was afraid, but because the truth wasn't ready yet. Not for him, not for them, not until it spoke louder than the silence. That night, she opened her notebook again. She wrote slowly, carefully, one entry at a time. Opened curtain 2 inches. Light reached crib. Gabriel tracked mirror. No eye drops. Increased response. Found name, Dr. Ernest Vale. Then, at the bottom, in quiet handwriting, they are responding to light. I don't think they're blind. I think someone made them this way. The mirror was small. Just a piece from Joy's old compact, the kind she used to keep in her purse back when life was simpler. She'd cleaned it, dried it, and set it gently on the nursery shelf near the window, where the late afternoon light passed through like a blessing. She didn't tell anyone. Some truths don't come in speeches. They arrive in quiet gestures, like a hand placing a mirror on the floor to see what happens next. It was nearly 5 p.m. The house was still. Dinner was being prepped in the kitchen, the soft clatter of utensils echoing faintly through the vents. The housekeeper had left early that day, and no one else ever came into the nursery this time of day. Just Joy. And the boys. She sat between their cribs, knees folded, the mirror angled just so. A sliver of light caught it, bouncing across the wall, then the floor, then the tiny giraffe toy between them. Gabriel's eyes caught the shimmer first. He blinked once, then again, then turned his face toward it, with a slow, searching motion. Michael followed, his fingers twitching near the rails of his crib. The light danced gently across the bars. His head moved with it. Joy felt her throat tighten, but she stayed still, no sound, no sudden breath. Her hand, steady. Her heart, loud. This was no accident. They were watching. They were seeing. They were reaching for the thing the world said didn't exist. And then, a creak in the hallway. Soft, careful. She didn't look. She didn't need to. Some footsteps carry a weight only grief can make. Even when silent, they say everything. She knew it was him. Charles Walker stood at the threshold of the nursery. He didn't speak. Didn't move. Didn't interrupt. The door was open just wide enough for him to see everything. Joy, sitting on the floor. The mirror in her hand. His sons, eyes lit with something he hadn't seen since the day they were born. Light. Movement. Life. She turned her head slightly, caught him in her periphery, but didn't panic. She just whispered, "We're playing." Her voice was soft. Too soft for defense. Too strong for denial. Charles stepped in, slow, almost like he didn't trust the floor beneath him. His eyes flicked from Joy to the boys, to the shimmer on the wall, to the expression on Gabriel's face. He didn't sit down. He didn't ask questions. He just stared. And in that long, aching moment, something happened in his face, not dramatic, not loud. A breaking. A soft kind. The kind men try to swallow when no one's watching. "What is this?" he asked, finally. His voice wasn't angry, just cracked, worn down to the bone. Joy looked up. Her hands didn't move. "They see the light," she said quietly. "They're following it." He blinked. Once. Twice. Then shook his head, almost like trying to wake himself from a dream. "That's not." He stopped. Started again. "That's not possible." But his eyes didn't leave the boys. Michael reached again, his hand brushing the edge of light on the floor. Gabriel tilted his head, tracking the flicker on the ceiling. "They've never," he whispered. "Not once. Not in 2 years." Joy nodded gently. "I know. That's what I thought too." The room went quiet again. Not the empty kind. The heavy kind. The kind of silence that follows truth when it finally walks in. Charles looked at Joy, then really looked. Not as a maid, not as someone passing through, but as a witness, a person who had stayed long enough to notice what no one else did, a person who wasn't afraid to look again. He didn't speak after that. He just turned, slowly, and walked out. The door stayed open behind him, and for the first time since Joy arrived, the light from the hallway was allowed to stay. That night, she didn't write in her notebook. She sat on the edge of her bed, the mirror resting in her hands, and just stared at it. There were still no answers, no guarantees, no proof anyone would believe. But she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. Charles didn't speak of it the next morning. Not to Joy, not to the boys, not to anyone. He didn't even glance at the mirror on the nursery shelf. Didn't ask where it came from. Didn't ask why his sons had followed the light. But something had changed in him. Joy could see it. He lingered in the hallway longer than usual, paused outside the nursery door before heading into his office. Watched, quietly, when she bathed the boys as if afraid to see too much or not enough. He didn't want to believe. But he didn't want to look away either. That afternoon, Joy did something bold. She walked into the study holding a notebook. Not a report, not a complaint. Just pages filled with days of observations, scribbled in careful handwriting, like pieces of a puzzle only she had tried to fit together. Charles looked up from his desk. His expression wasn't cold, just guarded, like a man who spent years building walls for good reason and isn't sure yet whether to tear one down. Joy stood still in front of him, not demanding, not pushing, just offering. "I'd like to show you something," she said softly. "You don't have to agree, just look." She opened the notebook. Page by page, she showed him. The time she opened the curtain and Michael blinked. The day Gabriel tracked the sunlight across the ceiling. The evening she skipped the drops and saw more movement than ever before. The label warnings, the dosage logs, the name Dr. Ernest Vale. Charles didn't interrupt. He sat there in silence, the kind that listens. One hand at his mouth, the other resting flat on the table, fingers curled slightly, like holding something invisible. He turned a page, read, then another. At one point, his eyes paused on a note Joy had barely remembered writing. "Light doesn't lie. It just waits for someone to see it." He closed the notebook slowly, then looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw something unguarded in his face. "I never wanted to believe it," he said. His voice was low, quiet but not lost. "When they told me, after Caroline died, I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to. I couldn't. I was afraid to hope." Joy didn't answer. She didn't have to. She knew what it cost to hope when it had let you down before. Charles looked toward the hallway, toward the nursery he had barely entered in months. "They told me not to expect progress, that blind children don't always respond, that silence was normal, that this was our life now." He looked back at her, and I believed them, because it was easier than believing something might still be possible. There was a pause. The room felt smaller now, not cramped, but close, as if everything inside it had leaned in. "Do you think it's the drops?" he asked. Joy nodded. "I think it's part of it, and I think someone knew. I don't know why yet, but the patterns don't lie." Charles stood, slowly. He looked like a man holding something fragile, something he hadn't touched in years. "Let's stop them, just for a couple days." Joy met his gaze. "Are you sure?" "No," he said, "but I can't ignore it anymore." For the next 48 hours, they stopped the drops. Together, Joy tracked everything, every blink, every turn of the head, every flicker of recognition. Charles began joining her quietly in the nursery. Not with questions, not with control, just presence. He sat on the floor once, knees stiff, unsure how to move, how to play. But the boys didn't seem to mind. When Michael reached toward the soft beam of light falling across the rug, Charles whispered, "He sees it." Joy smiled gently. "Yes," she said, "he does." Gabriel squinted at the mirror, then laughed not loudly, but enough to echo. Charles put a hand to his chest, as if something inside had startled awake. That evening, he asked Joy something simple. "Do you believe this was always there, and we just missed it?" She looked at the boys, now curled in their blankets, breathing slow. "I think it was waiting," she said, "for someone to look again." It was Joy's idea. She found the letter decals in a drawer of old toys stuck beneath a broken puzzle box, half yellowed with time. They were meant for windows. Colorful letters, soft adhesive, a child's name, spelled out in light. She held them in her hands for a long time before doing anything. Then one morning, just after breakfast, she walked into the nursery and opened the curtains all the way. For the first time, sunlight flooded the room. Not just a crack or a corner, but full. It hit the cribs, the floor, the books, the mirror on the shelf, and something else too. The dust. Years of it, floating upward like spirits unbottled. Joy stood by the window and pressed the letters softly, one by one, onto the glass. G. A. B. R. I. E. L. Then the next. M. I. C. H. A. E. L. The boys didn't speak, but they watched the light move across their names, watched her hands trace the shapes, watched like they knew on some wordless level that something sacred was happening. And for a moment, it felt like the house was holding its breath. Charles didn't come until later. The nursery was quieter now, sunlight soft and golden, warming the carpet like grace itself had entered through the window. Joy was sitting with the boys, Gabriel curled beside her, Michael on her lap. They were playing with nothing, just the light on the floor, the mirror catching it, bouncing it gently across the rug. Charles stepped in. But this time, he didn't stop at the doorway. He knelt down beside them, slower than usual, his joints stiff, his hands unsure. But he came close, closer than he ever had. Joy glanced up, offering a small smile. He didn't return it. His eyes were locked on the glass, on the names. Then, without looking at her, he spoke. Caroline picked those names. His voice was low, not choked, not shaky, just buried, like someone digging something up they weren't sure they wanted to find. Joy said nothing. She loved angels, he continued, not in a cheesy way, just, she said she wanted names that meant something. He stared at the letters on the window, the way the sunlight cut through them. She died before she ever got to say them out loud. There it was. Not just pain, not just memory, but the breaking. Not with sound, but with stillness. He leaned back against the wall, one hand over his mouth, eyes shining but not falling. Joy didn't speak. She just let it hang. Sometimes silence is the only kind of respect. A few minutes passed. Then Gabriel did something he hadn't done before. He reached up toward the window. His fingers brushed the glass, landed on the G. He held it there. Charles watched, breath tight, lips parted, like a man not ready to breathe again just yet. Then Michael, not to be left behind, scooted forward, a quiet grunt in his throat, and touched the M. They didn't know what the letters meant, but their fingers traced them, like memory. Charles blinked, then whispered, "They've never done that before." Joy finally spoke gently. "They're learning their names." He nodded once, but it broke something anyway. He closed his eyes, exhaled, and for the first time since she met him, Charles looked small. Not weak, not pitiful, just human. Just a man whose life had been too quiet for too long. Later, Joy found him sitting in the sunroom, a room no one used. The curtains had always stayed closed in there. The plants had died long ago. But now, the windows were open, and he was sitting in the light. She stood in the doorway for a moment, then stepped in, carefully. "I'm sorry," he said without looking at her. Joy paused. For what? For letting go too early, for choosing silence over searching. He turned toward her. "You didn't just see my sons, you saw what I couldn't." She didn't respond with words. She just sat down beside him, knees almost touching. The silence between them wasn't heavy this time. It was healing. And outside, the wind lifted the curtain, just enough to let the sun fall softly on the floor. Charles didn't return to his office the next morning. He sat in the sunroom, just like the night before. The curtains open now, the light stretching across the cold tile like it had been waiting for years. A mug of coffee rested on the table beside him, still full, untouched. He wasn't reading, wasn't making calls, just sitting, still, watching dust float in the sunlight like tiny reminders of time he couldn't get back. Joy passed by once, then again, and finally stepped inside. He didn't look at her, but she could tell he knew she was there. His voice was quiet when it came. "You said someone knew." She paused. "Yes." "About the drops?" "Yes." He nodded, slowly, as if confirming a suspicion that had already formed. "I let them into this house. I paid them. I handed over my sons." Joy sat down across from him, her hands folded in her lap. "You were grieving. I was hiding." Silence settled between them again, not hostile, just hard. He turned toward her, not angry, just exhausted. "Do you know what it's like to believe the worst because it's easier than hoping?" Joy met his gaze. "I think hope scares people more than pain does." He let out a short breath. Not a laugh, not a cry, just the sound of someone standing on the edge of regret. That afternoon, Charles called his lawyer, asked for the medical release forms, reviewed every note signed, every approval, every prescription. Then he called someone else, a name Joy hadn't heard before, Dr. Ernest Vale. The man on the other end of the call answered with practiced ease, calm, clinical. "Mr. Walker, everything all right?" Charles didn't speak right away. "I want a full breakdown of the boy's prescriptions, every drug, every change, every reason." "Of course, but may I ask what prompted?" "Just send it, by tonight." His tone wasn't cold, it was awake now. And Ernest Vale, whoever he really was, knew it. Later, Joy found Charles in the nursery. He was standing by the cribs, watching his sons sleep. No clipboard, no phone, just watching. Michael had one hand resting against the letter M on the window. Gabriel was curled beneath the sunlight, his small chest rising and falling in rhythm. "They don't need perfect," Joy said softly behind him. "They just need present." He nodded, slowly. "I don't know how to fix this." "Start with not turning away." He stayed there for a long time. The next morning, Joy made a decision. She contacted someone she hadn't spoken to in years. A friend of her grandmother's, a retired nurse who'd once worked in pharmaceutical compliance. She told her just enough to raise concern, and the woman gave her a name. A young lab technician who had recently resigned from a private clinic involved in experimental pediatric trials. "I'll reach out," Joy said. Quietly, the investigation began in silence. Charles hired a private investigator, discreet, professional. Joy started keeping more detailed notes. Photos, patterns, times, dosage, changes, reactions. The twins continued to grow brighter, not suddenly, not miraculously, but steadily. They reached more, turned more, responded more. And every time they did, the weight in Charles's chest pressed harder. Because every blink was a question. How long has this been possible? What did I miss? What did I allow? One night, just after the twins had gone to sleep, Joy found Charles at the kitchen table. He had the folder open in front of him, the one from Dr. Vale. Pages of prescriptions, notes, authorizations, all signed, all legal, all clean. Too clean. "Nothing here explains anything," he said, flipping through. "They covered it well." "That's how shadows work," Joy said. "They don't need chaos, just quiet." He looked up. "I want to go public. Not yet, but soon." Joy nodded. "We will, when the story's ready, when the truth is loud enough." And then, for the first time, he said their names. Out loud, clearly, Gabriel, Michael. The sound of them caught in his throat, not broken, just heavy with meaning. Joy smiled. They know you're saying it. Do you think they forgive me? She didn't answer right away. She looked at the window where their names still clung to the glass. Letters bent slightly from the sun, but still holding. I think they're waiting. For what? For you to see them, not like the world sees them, not like doctors did, but as your boys. Charles didn't speak, but this time he stayed in the room. The story didn't break with shouting. It started with a photo. Gabriel's hand resting on the letter G. Michael turning toward a beam of light, eyes open, focused, alive. Joy had taken it weeks earlier, not to prove anything, just to remember. But now it became a seed, the kind you plant quietly and pray it grows. Charles gave it to a reporter he trusted, a woman who once wrote about his late wife's foundation, someone who remembered Caroline not as a name in a headline, but as a human being. He didn't give her everything, not yet. Just enough. Enough to start the questions. The article came out on a Wednesday. Born blind or made blind. A Billionaire'S twins and the nurse who noticed. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't cruel. It was curious, the kind of truth that doesn't scream, but lingers. Within 24 hours, the phone started ringing. Lawyers, doctors, journalists, parents. The next day, another article. Then a radio segment. Then a televised interview request, not for Charles, for Joy. She declined. Not yet, she told him. Let the story speak first. The court date came faster than anyone expected. The lab denied everything. The doctor, Dr. Ernest Vale, claimed full legal authority. Every signature, every document, every dose had been approved. Joy testified first. She didn't cry. She didn't waver. She just told the truth moment by moment, memory by memory. She spoke of blinking, light, laughter, the way silence can lie when no one questions it. She spoke of her grandmother's voice. You don't need a degree to pay attention. The courtroom didn't move when she finished. But it didn't need to. Truth doesn't need applause. It just needs to land. Charles took the stand next. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Just stood there, one hand on the edge of the podium, the other resting near his chest, like holding something invisible. I believed what they told me, he began. I didn't ask enough questions. I didn't pay attention. And because of that, my sons were put through something I'll never fully understand. He looked down for a moment, then back up. But someone did pay attention. Not for money, not for recognition. Just because she cared. She saw what none of us saw. And because of her, I got to see my sons for the first time. He didn't speak long, but no one in that room looked away. When the whistleblower came forward, the young technician Joy had reached through her contact, the case cracked wide open. She brought evidence. Emails, formulas, trials not listed in public records, payments, protocols, internal messages about light suppression datasets. The truth didn't scream. It stacked page by page, fact by fact. And when the judge ruled, when the verdict came down, the room didn't erupt. It exhaled. Malpractice confirmed. Experimental drug trials without proper consent. Severe ethical breaches. The clinic was shut down. Dr. Vale lost his license. And the boys, Gabriel and Michael, became something more than a headline. They became seen. Back at the estate, the windows stayed open now. Light lived there again. Not loud, not blinding, but soft, honest, free. One morning, Joy brought in a set of clear window crayons, the kind you can use to write messages on glass. She handed one to Gabriel. You want to try? He looked at her eyes, focused, aware, and took it in his small hand. She steadied his grip, helped him make the first letter. J. Michael joined. Scribbled beside it. Joy couldn't tell what he meant to write, but she didn't correct him. It was perfect. Charles stood in the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, and when Gabriel turned to him, eyes full of light, and smiled, Charles smiled back. "They see you," Joy said gently. He nodded. "And now I see them." The house was no longer quiet. Not like before. The kind of silence that once settled into the walls, heavy and constant, had been replaced with something new. Stillness that breathed. Laughter that echoed down the hall without apology. Voices not many, not loud but alive. The curtains stayed open now. Not just in the nursery. Everywhere. Windows that once held years of dust now framed sunlight. Light that moved across the floor like forgiveness. Light that had always wanted in, just waited for someone to let it. Joy was packing. Not quickly, not sadly, but with care. Her contract was up. No one had asked her to stay, and she hadn't expected to. Charles had thanked her more times than she could count, in quiet gestures, in changed routines, in the way he no longer walked past the nursery like it wasn't there. But still, this was never meant to be hers. She folded the last of her clothes into a small duffel and turned to look at the room that had held her for months. Simple, quiet, but full now. Full of memory, full of proof. Downstairs, Charles was waiting. He stood in the entryway, dressed simply, no suit, no tie, just a father, trying to find words for something that mattered. When she came down the stairs, he didn't speak right away. He just looked at her the way someone does when they finally see not just what you did, but who you are. Then he handed her something. A leather-bound book. Simple, unmarked. Inside, the first page already written. His handwriting small, steady. Walker Thompson Family Logbook. Entry 1. Gabriel smiled at his reflection. Michael touched the light. Joy laughed. Charles breathed. Joy blinked, slow. Her fingers tightened around the edges of the book. "It's yours," he said quietly. "Ours, if you'll stay." She didn't answer with words. She just nodded once. And smiled. That evening, they sat together in the new sunroom, where the ivy had started to grow again along the windows. The boys were on the floor, chasing the glint of a silver wind chime that hung from the open window. Gabriel's fingers brushed it. Michael laughed, full and clear. Charles turned to Joy. "What do you call this?" She looked at the boys, the light, the air moving through the room like breath. "Attention," she said. "And grace." In the weeks that followed, Charles made it official. Not just the foundation, though, they did that too. The Second Glance Foundation. Built to advocate for children misdiagnosed, for mothers and caregivers ignored, for stories silenced by systems that never paid attention. But the family part, that's what mattered most. One morning, Joy placed new decals on the nursery window. Gabriel. Michael. And beneath them, just one more. Joy. The boys traced the letters with their fingers. Michael looked up, pointed to hers, and said it clearly. "Joy." She turned, startled, eyes glassed with disbelief. Charles stood in the doorway. "They see you," he said. "And now I do too." Years from now, people would ask how it happened, how blindness could be misdiagnosed, how so many experts could miss what one maid noticed in a mirror, and no one would have a perfect answer, because it wasn't just science, it wasn't just medicine, and it wasn't just one blink. It was love that paid attention. It was truth that refused to be quiet. It was God moving, not in thunder, but in the watching eyes of a child who followed light. Joy would never call it a miracle. She would sit with Gabriel and Michael on the floor and say softly, "You weren't waiting to be healed. You were waiting to be seen." The house glows now, not from wealth, not from restoration, but from windows that stay open, from names written in glass, and laughter that no one dares to silence anymore, from light finally having a home to live in. He didn't expect to hear anything, not in that house, not from her. But the sound stopped him in his tracks, soft, light, almost impossible. Laughter, coming from the kitchen. His pulse quickened, not with joy, but with confusion. He stepped forward, slowly, each footfall echoing down the cold marble hallway, the scent of soap and lemon in the air. And then he saw it, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even make sense of what was happening, because what he was looking at made no sense at all. Charles Graham built his fortune in silence, the kind of silence that lives in boardrooms, that follows you home in sleek black cars, that looks like peace from the outside, but feels like failure behind closed doors. He lived at the top of Manhattan in a penthouse polished like a showroom, private chef, round-the-clock staff, everything under control except the only thing that mattered. Lucy, his daughter, 6 years old, nonverbal, autistic, and until that day, untouched by joy. She didn't speak, didn't look you in the eye, didn't laugh, at least not since her mother left. Charles had tried everything. Specialists from every corner of the country, devices, programs, even a therapy horse flown in from Vermont. Nothing worked, nothing changed. Lucy stayed in her world, and Charles stayed in his. He kept his meetings. He missed her birthdays. He avoided the silence by filling it with work. Until that morning, a rainy Wednesday, he'd forgotten his laptop, came home mid-morning, didn't even tell the staff he was coming. And now he stood frozen in the doorway, staring at something he didn't know how to process. Lucy, perched on someone's shoulders, a young woman at the sink, humming while scrubbing a pot. And Lucy, laughing, freely, joyfully, her little hands flapping, eyes bright, body alive. Charles couldn't remember the last time he saw her like that. Maybe he never had, but instead of joy, what rose in him was fear, then anger, then something far worse. He opened his mouth and destroyed it all. Before we go deeper, click subscribe, tap like, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. This story is about the kind of love that doesn't always look like love at first, but finds a way when we least expect it. What happened in that kitchen wasn't the beginning of a breakdown, it was the beginning of a reckoning. And for Charles Graham, the man who had everything, it was the first time he realized what he was truly missing. He wasn't always this cold. Once Charles Graham was the kind of man who believed in legacy, in building something that mattered, not just for profit, but for family, for a future. But the day Lucy stopped speaking, something inside him stopped too. He tried to keep going, tried to be the man the world still believed he was. 40 years old, head of a tech empire that went from garage code to global IPO in 6 years. Investors called him a genius. Magazines called him a miracle. But at home, there was no press, no applause, just the quiet click of his dress shoes on hardwood floors and a daughter who couldn't say his name. Lucy had been diagnosed at 4, autism, non-verbal, sensory sensitive. Charles remembered sitting in that white office, blinking through medical terms like a man who spoke only numbers. His wife never made it to the follow-up. She packed a suitcase that fall and left a single note by the door. "I can't do this." Neither could he, if he was being honest. But Charles didn't leave. He stayed. Just not all the way. He handed Lucy's care to professionals, rotated through therapists like apps on his phone, hired a full-time nanny, part-time behavioral coach, private chef, and an estate manager who oversaw it all. Every corner of the penthouse was curated for ease, child-safe, ultra-modern and completely sterile, a place that looked perfect and felt like nothing. Lucy lived mostly in the East Wing. Her room, the sensory space, and the quiet kitchen where she'd often sit for hours, tapping blocks or tracing the window glass with her fingers. Charles told himself she was okay. That silence was just her version of peace. But in truth, he stopped going in there. He left before she woke, returned after she was asleep, and when he did try to connect, kneeling beside her, reaching for her hand, she'd pull away like he was a stranger. Sometimes she'd hum, just a low, fragile tone, like she was trying to find something only she could hear. It haunted him more than any silence ever could. Still, he kept moving. Because movement at least felt like control. He worked late, traveled often, told himself it was all for her, for Lucy's future. But the truth was quieter and heavier. He was afraid, not of her diagnosis, but of what it revealed in him, the helplessness, the failures he couldn't outrun, no matter how many millions he made. And then came that morning, the one he hadn't planned, a cancelled meeting, a forgotten laptop, the rain falling hard on the city, smearing the skyline like watercolor. He'd stepped into his home expecting silence. Instead, he heard something he hadn't heard in years. Joy. Not music. Not a therapist's song. Not a toy making noise. Laughter. Real. Messy. Alive. And for a moment, he didn't recognize it, until he followed it. Down the hallway, into the kitchen, and saw his daughter, Lucy, lifted high on the shoulders of a woman he barely remembered hiring. The new housekeeper, Grace. She was humming, bare feet on the tile, soap bubbles floating around them like tiny stars. Lucy's face was wide open, bright, wild with wonder, clapping her hands as if the world had just let her in for the first time. It should have been a miracle. But to Charles, it felt like chaos. She could fall. She could be overstimulated. She could shut down. His fear took over before his heart could catch up, and with one sentence, he tore it all apart. He didn't know it then. But that single reaction would cost him more than he ever imagined, and what would follow wasn't discipline. It was loss. Real, soul-deep, irreversible loss. He raised his voice before he could lower his fear. What the hell is going on in here? It wasn't just loud. It was sharp, like glass cutting through a moment that had no defenses. Grace froze. The sponge slipped from her hand and hit the sink with a splash. Lucy stopped laughing. Her arms dropped to her sides. Her body stiffened. The smile vanished from her face like it had never been there at all. Charles stepped forward, furious, not because she'd done something wrong, but because he didn't know what she'd done at all. His daughter was on a stranger's shoulders, a child who flinched at touch, now wrapped around this woman like she was part of her. It didn't make sense. It didn't feel safe, it didn't feel controlled. And for Charles Graham, control was survival. "Get her down, now," he snapped. Grace bent her knees slowly, lowering Lucy to the floor with careful hands. No sudden movement, no panic. But Lucy was already shrinking, her body curling inward, her fingers twitching at her sides. The look on her face wasn't confusion, it was fear. "She was safe," Grace said softly. "She asked to see the bubbles. I thought—" "You thought," he cut in, jaw tight. "You don't get paid to think." Grace stood up straight. She didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. "I just wanted her to smile," she said. And she did. But he wasn't listening. He couldn't. He was already too far gone. "You're not her therapist. You're not her parent. You're a maid. A maid. Stay in your lane." He didn't mean to say it that way, but it came out with all the weight of everything he hadn't said in months. Grace looked at him. No tears, no defense, just a kind of quiet disbelief, like she'd seen this before, from other people, in other rooms. "Sir," she said gently, "I would never put her in danger." But Charles wasn't in the room anymore. He was in his own head, spiraling, seeing headlines, liability, lawsuits. What if she had fallen? What if she'd gotten hurt? "You're fired," he said flatly. "Sir, please, no discussion. I want you out by the hour. Marta will sort your things." Grace blinked like she hadn't heard him, but she had. Lucy let out a small sound, not quite a cry, but something close. A strained whimper, the kind she used when she was overwhelmed and couldn't process it fast enough. Grace knelt beside her. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered. "I'm right here, sweetheart, I'm not—" Charles stepped forward. "Don't touch her." Grace looked up. "She needs—" I said, "Don't touch her." Her hands slowly lifted away. Lucy turned toward her, arms stretched out, needing the comfort that had just been ripped away. But Grace didn't move. She stood, nodded once, and walked out, leaving behind the sponge, the gloves, the bubbles still floating in the sink. Lucy crawled to the kitchen door, sat down, and stayed there. Charles tried to pick her up. She wriggled free. When he reached for her again, she slapped his hand and let out a shrill, broken sound he hadn't heard since she was 2. He stood still, staring at the door Grace had walked through, at the child sitting on the floor like she'd been dropped. And in that moment, he felt it. Not guilt. Not yet. Just something heavier, like the weight of a moment he wouldn't be able to take back. The house went quiet again after that, but not the same kind of quiet. This one felt heavier, like something sacred had been torn out of the air and no one knew how to name it. Lucy stayed by the kitchen door that night. She didn't eat, didn't move, just sat cross-legged on the tile, holding the wooden spoon Grace had once handed her during their first breakfast together. Marta tried coaxing her, softly, gently, offering snacks, toys, even Lucy's favorite blanket. But the girl didn't flinch. She stared at the space where Grace had stood, as if time could rewind if she just waited long enough. By morning, her blankets were gone from the bed and folded into a pile beside the pantry door. She wouldn't go back to her room, wouldn't speak, wouldn't sleep, wouldn't play, just sat. And by the second night, she began humming. But not her usual low hum. This one had a tune, a melody Grace used to sing while folding laundry. Marta stood behind the doorframe, clutching a dish towel, tears in her eyes. Charles didn't notice at first. He was already diving back into damage control, emailing HR to list a new housekeeper position, calling Lucy's therapist to reassess her schedule. He brought home a new sensory toy, left it on the table beside her. She didn't touch it. He tried kneeling again, held out his hand. But this time Lucy wouldn't even look at him. When he reached for her cheek, she turned away. She had never done that before. And suddenly, the silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishment. By the third day, she stopped eating more than a few bites. Marta called the pediatrician, who said regression was common during emotional disruption, especially in children like Lucy. Just keep the routine consistent, they said. But nothing was consistent anymore. Not without Grace. And Charles was beginning to feel it. The sense that something had slipped through his fingers, something fragile and irreplaceable. He stood at the doorway that night, watching Lucy curl into herself on the floor, rocking gently, clutching that spoon like it meant something he couldn't understand. He didn't move, didn't speak, because deep down, he knew. He wasn't who she was waiting for. Marta entered quietly behind him. "Sir," she said, voice low, "I need to say something, and I know it's not my place, but I've been here too long not to speak." Charles didn't turn around. "She's getting worse," Marta continued. "You see it, I see it, and I know you don't want to hear this, but I have to tell you anyway." He looked at her, exhausted, angry, desperate for someone to blame. "You made a mistake," she said softly. Charles's jaw clenched. She was being careless. What if Lucy had fallen? She didn't. "That's not the point." "She laughed, sir," Marta interrupted gently but firmly. "For the first time in her life. I've been here since Lucy was born. I've never seen her smile like that." Charles exhaled through his nose, trying to keep control of the conversation, but Marta wasn't finished. "She wasn't just smiling," she said. "She was alive, and you took that away." Charles stepped back, shaking his head. "She's just adjusting. She'll be fine." "No, sir, she won't." Her next words dropped like stone. "She said something." Charles blinked. "What?" Marta nodded, eyes glassy. She looked at Grace and said a word. He stared at her, not breathing. She said, "Mommy." Clear as day. Time stopped. Charles looked back toward the kitchen. Lucy was still there, still rocking, still waiting. And suddenly, he couldn't feel his hands. He wanted to ask Marta to repeat it, wanted to deny it, wanted to believe she'd misheard, imagined it, wanted it too badly. But he knew Marta. She didn't lie. And the weight of that one word, "Mommy," broke something open inside him. Something that had been locked tight for far too long. He had fired the only person who'd ever reached her. Now she was gone. And Lucy was slipping away with her. He didn't sleep that night. Not after what Marta said. Not after hearing that one word echo again and again in his head. "Mommy." He watched Lucy through the hallway window, curled up on the kitchen floor beneath the pantry light, her small body still rocking gently, her eyes wide and blank. And suddenly all the things he thought were final weren't. The firing, the rules, the decisions he made to stay in control. He'd been wrong. So completely, painfully wrong. And now he had to fix it. But Grace was gone. By morning, Charles had called the agency 3 times. No answer. The 4th time, a woman picked up. Polite, rehearsed, distant. "Grace Abraham," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "She worked here until 4 days ago. I need to speak with her." "I'm sorry, sir, there's no forwarding contact. No number. She didn't leave one." "What about an address?" "All we have is a P.O. box and a temporary Queen's shelter listed on her intake file. No residential information." Charles hung up without saying goodbye. Then he stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at Lucy's untouched cereal bowl. He was a billionaire. He could buy land, move markets, track down CEOs across continents, but he couldn't find a single woman who had changed his daughter's life in less than 2 weeks. By noon, he'd called every shelter in Queens. Some were helpful. Most weren't. No one recognized the name. No one could place her face. A few volunteers promised to check the intake logs and call him back. No one did. Lucy didn't move from her spot, not even when Marta tried to carry her to bed. She cried for the first time that evening, not loudly, just a soft, hollow sobbing, like her body had forgotten how to weep properly. That night, Charles sat beside her and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't react. He whispered it again. Still nothing. The next morning, he hired a private investigator. He didn't ask about cost, didn't ask how long it would take. He just said the name, showed the resume from the agency file, and gave the only lead he had, the shelter. The man didn't blink, just said, "I'll find her." And then Charles waited. Each day blurred into the next. Lucy stayed curled by the door, now with her back to the world. She stopped humming, stopped crying. She simply withdrew. He tried talking. He tried toys. He tried being present. But he had shown up too late. Whatever Grace had unlocked in those short, impossible days was slipping away. And it was all his fault. On the 6th day, the investigator called. "She's not at the shelter anymore," he said. "Hasn't been for weeks, but someone remembered her. Said she used to come by with her little brother. Gave us a new lead." Charles didn't ask what it was. He was already grabbing his coat. It was raining again, the same way it had that morning in the kitchen. He arrived at a worn-down building in Queens, the kind with rusted gates and cracked steps. No elevator, 5 flights of stairs. By the 4th, he was winded. By the 5th, he was shaking. He raised his hand, knocked twice. The door creaked open. A girl, maybe 8, maybe younger, peeked out with cautious eyes. "Who are you?" I'm looking for Grace." The girl called over her shoulder. "Jew! There's a man at the door." A pause. Then footsteps. Grace appeared, towel over one shoulder, her face unreadable. The moment she saw him, something in her jaw tightened. Her arms folded across her chest. "What do you want?" Charles opened his mouth, but for once the words didn't come easily. He wasn't here as a CEO, not as a man with money, not with power, just a father who had run out of chances. "I need to talk to you," he said quietly. Grace didn't answer. She just waited, and in the silence between them stood everything he'd broken. Now he would have to face it, all of it. Grace didn't move from the doorway. She stood there, arms crossed, blocking the threshold with the quiet strength of someone who's learned the hard way what not to let back in. Charles felt the heat rise behind his collar, not from arrogance, not from anger, from shame, the kind that doesn't flinch, the kind that lingers. "I shouldn't have come unannounced," he said. Grace raised an eyebrow. "But you did." Her voice wasn't cold, just tired, like someone who'd already rehearsed this conversation and expected it wouldn't matter. Behind her, A kettle whistled on the stove. On the couch, a boy sat cross-legged, scribbling math problems in a workbook. Her world, small, cluttered, alive. He took a breath. "Lucy isn't okay." Grace didn't react. "She hasn't spoken. She's barely eating. She won't sleep unless she's by the kitchen door." Grace blinked, slow and unreadable. "You fired me." "I know. In front of your staff. Like I was nothing. I was wrong. You were cruel." He swallowed hard. "I was scared," he said. "I saw something I didn't understand, and instead of asking questions, I reacted. I thought I was protecting her." Grace leaned against the frame. "From what? Joy?" That landed. He looked down at his hands, like maybe they could explain what words couldn't. "I've never seen her like that before," he said. "Not once." Grace didn't speak, didn't nod, just watched. "She called you something," Charles said quietly. Now she looked at him. He met her eyes. "Marta told me. She called you Mommy." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of things unsaid, full of the weight of that word, spoken for the first time by a little girl who had never spoken at all. Grace's eyes welled, but she blinked them dry. "I didn't teach her that," she said. "She chose it." "I know." Charles stepped back slightly, gave her space to breathe, to decide. "I'm not here to ask you to come back the way things were," he said, "because they can't be and they shouldn't be." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a plain white envelope and offered it to her. Grace didn't take it. "It's not money," he added. "It's a proposal, something different, on your terms, if you're willing to hear it." Still, she didn't move. He let the envelope fall onto the table just inside the door. "She needs you," he said finally. Then softer, "I need you too. Not as help, not as staff, as someone Lucy chose, as someone I failed to see." Grace looked at him for a long time. Not angry, not forgiving, just measuring, trying to decide if this man was the same one who'd thrown her out like she didn't matter, or someone new. And Charles stood in that doorway, waiting, not as a billionaire, not as a father with regrets, but as a man trying to earn back the trust he shattered. Grace finally stepped back from the door, just enough to let him see inside, not enough to invite him in. Not yet. The door didn't close, but it didn't open all the way either. What came next would be her decision, and this time he wouldn't try to control it. She let him sit at the small table by the window, not because she trusted him, but because Lucy did. The envelope stayed untouched between them, still sealed, still quiet, neither of them reaching for it. Grace poured tea for herself, didn't ask if he wanted any. Her brother glanced over from the couch, wary, but Grace gave a small nod, and he returned to his homework. Charles had never felt more out of place, which, somehow, felt right. This wasn't his home, not his terms, and for once, he didn't try to fix that. "I don't want to go back to what it was," Grace said finally. Her voice was calm, direct, not angry, but not soft either. "I don't want to be your maid, I never was. That's just the title someone put on the payroll." Charles nodded. "I understand." "No," she said. "You don't, but you will." He didn't interrupt. Grace took a slow sip of tea, then set the cup down. "I'll come back," she said, "but only under my conditions." Charles looked up. She didn't flinch. "First," she said, "I come back as Lucy's developmental caregiver. That means I decide how we work with her. I won't be cleaning baseboards or folding your suits." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "Second, I finish my degree, early childhood development. I was halfway through when I had to drop out. I'll cover it, tuition, materials, everything. Third," she continued, "my little brother gets transferred to a proper school, somewhere safe, somewhere that sees him for who he is, not who they assume he'll become." Charles glanced toward the boy on the couch, quiet, focused, determined not to look back. "Done," he said. "He'll have options." And last, Grace leaned forward, not to intimidate but to be clear. I want respect, Charles. Not sir, not Mr. Graham. Charles. No yelling, no talking down to me, no treating me like I'm disposable when you get uncomfortable. Her voice didn't shake. She meant every word. I'm not coming back to be erased. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he nodded. Not just agreed, he said softly. Promised. Grace watched him. Really watched him. Not searching for weakness, just for truth. Then finally she leaned back. That envelope? She said. Open it when you get home. He nodded again. But he didn't reach for it. He didn't ask for a hug, didn't ask for a decision that day. He just stood quietly, and before leaving he turned toward her one last time. I was wrong about you, he said. Grace didn't smile. You weren't just wrong about me, she replied. You were wrong about your daughter. That one stung, because it was true and he knew it. He left with the envelope tucked under his arm, and 100 things heavier in his chest, and at home, waiting by the door, was a little girl still holding on to silence, and still hoping Grace would walk back through it. Grace returned on a Thursday. There was no grand arrival, no dramatic music or teary reunion, just the soft click of the front door, the quiet rustle of a bag placed gently on the floor. Lucy was sitting by the kitchen wall, exactly where she'd been for over a week. Head down, spoon clutched in her fist, eyes hollow, and then a scent, lavender and soap, a humming sound, low, familiar. Grace didn't announce herself. She simply walked past the doorway and started washing dishes, just like before. No ceremony, no instructions, just presence. At first, Lucy didn't move, didn't look, but a minute later there was a shift, a tilt of her head, a twitch of her fingers. Then she stood, slowly, carefully, as if afraid she might wake from something that wasn't a dream. She crossed the floor with quiet steps and reached for Grace's apron. Grace didn't turn. She just kept humming. Then Lucy pressed her forehead gently against Grace's back and let out a sound. A single broken syllable that cracked the quiet like morning light. Mommy. Grace closed her eyes. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just kept washing. That night, Lucy slept in her own bed for the first time in 12 days. In the weeks that followed, everything began to shift. Not dramatically, not quickly, just one breath at a time. Lucy laughed again, quietly at first, like she wasn't sure if it was allowed, then louder, full, alive. She let Grace comb her hair, let Charles sit beside her without pulling away, started clapping to music, dancing in circles, grabbing Grace's hands and spinning until they both fell over laughing on the rug. And then the words came, not in full sentences, not even every day, but real. Bubbles. Juice. Mommy. Dog. Charles listened to each one like it was a verse from scripture. He started coming home early, not for meetings, not for show, just to watch them. Sometimes he stayed in the doorway, didn't say a word, just stood there, watching his daughter come back to life. One afternoon he heard Lucy whisper something from across the room. She was lying on her back, her head on Grace's lap. Her voice was faint, like a secret. Mommy loves me. Charles had to leave the room. He didn't want them to see him cry. He wasn't sure when it happened, but something in him had changed. The boardroom didn't feel as urgent. The company no longer filled the void, and the silence he once drowned in was now full of music. Grace hadn't just returned to care for Lucy. She had redefined what care looked like: firm, gentle, intentional. There were charts on the fridge now, routine cards on the wall, flashcards by the sink, labeled with tiny drawings and stickers. And Lucy? She pointed at them, said the words when she could, and smiled when she couldn't. The girl who once lived in shadows was beginning to reach for the light. But love, Charles was learning, wasn't a single moment of redemption. It was 100 quiet ones, strung together by someone who refused to walk away. It started with a simple request. Grace had asked for a team meeting. Nothing formal, just a check-in with the household staff. They gathered in the living room. Marta, the chef, the driver, 2 assistants, even the security chief. Everyone was seated, except Charles. He stood by the window, hands clasped tightly behind his back. The moment didn't ask for luxury. It asked for something far harder. Humility. Grace stood beside the fireplace, shoulders relaxed, expression calm. Not demanding, not performative, just present. Charles turned slowly, faced the room, cleared his throat once, and then he spoke. 2 weeks ago, I made a mistake, he said, not just as a father, but as a man. The room fell still. I reacted from fear, not understanding. I let my pride speak louder than compassion, and I disrespected someone who gave my daughter more than I ever have. He looked at Grace, not with shame, with reverence. You brought Lucy back to life, he said, his voice tight. Not with therapy, not with money, but with patience, with warmth, with presence. The silence in the room thickened. I treated you like staff, like help, like someone who could be replaced. A pause. You can't be. Grace didn't look away, didn't flinch. She let him say what needed to be said. I'm sorry, Charles said. Not because I feel guilty, but because I was blind. He took a slow breath, then did something no one expected. He lowered himself to one knee. Not out of drama, but truth. A billionaire in a $1,000 suit, kneeling before the woman he once fired without thought. I'm asking for forgiveness, not for what I did, because I can't undo it, but for what I'll do differently from here on out. Grace looked down at him. Her eyes didn't soften, but they did shine, with something quiet, something real. She nodded. Apology accepted, she said. Then gently, let's move forward, not pretend it never happened. The staff exhaled like they'd all been holding something in. Marta wiped her eyes. The chef gave a quiet nod. Even the driver shifted in his seat, because they weren't just witnessing an apology, they were watching a man transform. That evening, Charles sat at the edge of Lucy's bed. Grace was reading beside her, voice soft, rhythmic. Lucy curled between them, her head resting on Grace's arm, her fingers gently tracing the fabric of Charles's sleeve. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like an outsider in his own home. He felt part of something, not because he deserved it, but because he chose to show up for it. Forgiveness wasn't a finish line, it was a door. And now that it was open, all that mattered was what came next. 2 years later, Grace stood at a podium in a deep blue cap and gown. The tassels swayed as she looked down at the degree in her hands, Bachelor of Science in Early Childhood Development, magna cum laude. She didn't cry, but Charles did. He sat in the front row beside Lucy, who clapped wildly as Grace's name was called. Lucy didn't need prompts anymore. She knew when to clap, she knew who she was clapping for. Life had changed, slowly, then all at once. Charles stepped down from his company's board the year Grace went back to school. Not because he had to, because he finally understood what he didn't want to miss. He poured his energy and his guilt into something new. The Lucy Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to supporting underprivileged neurodiverse children and training caregivers in Grace's development model. No tech, no stock charts, just people helping people. The first center opened in the Bronx. By year's end, there were 3 more. Lucy still didn't talk much, but she didn't have to. She laughed. She danced. She reached for people when she wanted them near. And she used her words, not many, but enough. Enough to tell the world she was in it now. That spring, the foundation hosted its first gala. Donors, families, teachers, staff. And on stage, under a warm halo of lights, stood an 8-year-old girl in a navy dress with silver shoes. She held a mic in both hands. Her eyes searched the crowd until they landed on 2 people, one on her left, one on her right. She smiled. I have 2 parents, she said, her voice soft but steady. One made me... She turned to Charles and squeezed his hand. And one found me. She turned to Grace, who was already in tears. The room fell silent. And then came the applause, louder than music, fuller than speeches. Charles didn't say a word that night. He didn't need to. Sometimes love wasn't something you said. It was something you learned how to show. Later that week, they visited a small garden just outside the new Queen's Centre. Charles pushed the gate open, while Grace walked with Lucy and her little brother Noah. The kids ran ahead, dirt under their nails, joy under their feet. Lucy paused at a small patch of soft soil. She crouched down, dug gently, and pulled a young rosebush from the canvas bag she'd carried. "Why a rose?" Grace asked softly. Lucy shrugged, then looked up at her, eyes steady, voice small but clear. "This one's for Mommy." Grace smiled, touched her chest. "For me?" Lucy nodded, then reached into the bag again and pulled out a second rose. "And this one's for second chances." Charles knelt beside her, gently helping guide her hands. The wind stirred through the leaves. Not loud, just enough to carry the sound of healing, enough to let something new take root. Not every story ends where it began. Some end in gardens, where silence becomes laughter, and love grows exactly where it was never supposed to.